who I don't know, which most of you I do, but there's a few new people here, which is great. My name is Miranda. I'm the director of the gallery. And this is, I can't tell you how excited I am about this event tonight and this whole exhibition, the way it came about, and the two amazing women that I worked with on this. This show actually came together in really less than a month. You know, yeah, really less than a month. So less than 2 months ago, I was sitting in a room with a group of women, and we were talking about a lot of the conversations that were happening in the political arena regarding women's bodies, mostly spoken by men. In fact, when women said words like vagina, they were silenced on the floor of the house. And so what was interesting for me was how devastated I was by those conversations. Things like illegitimate rape, I found to be really upsetting and was coded language for silencing women in their conversations about sexual violence and just about their bodies in general and sexuality in general, and just, you know, your life as a woman, and that this was all men talking about this, and it was powerful for me. So I happened to be with some good friends, some of whom are here tonight, sitting around a table drinking some wine and talking about these things, and it turned into a really amazing, deep and kind of probing and smart and wide-ranging conversation that I felt was one of those conversations that transcends the moment. And I thought, you know, this is really important. This is important stuff. And I ended up having conversations like that with the women faculty at the college where I teach, and I thought, you know, I want to do something with this. And so the idea of the Pussy Talks came about. And that was related to both the conversations in the American political arena, but also in the Pussy Riot Girls. The arrest was happening right at that time. So I started talking to my friends, and every woman I talked to kind of had the same reaction. And I ended up having lots of these conversations. And simultaneously, Alexi was having those conversations too. And I need to introduce you guys in just a second. Said she wanted to have a vagina show in response to those conversations about the word vagina being silenced, etc. And Alexi, so Alexi Brock is here. You need a standing ovation. Yes. As does Mia Brown now. Two women who are just not only just amazing artists, but incredible minds, brilliant women, amazing to work with. We had such a great time. I've never had such a satisfying and kind of inspiring working relationship before, so I'm so thrilled about that. So Alexi was separately having these conversations too, and talked to Mia about doing a show, and Mia said, oh, we need to talk to Patricia, and that was the magic happened. So originally it was going to be in an empty artist space in New Rochelle, and it moved here, and I'm just so thrilled. And this gallery has been here for quite a long time, and I guess I had been we had gallery talks and stuff like that before, but I really was thinking about wanting to move things in a different direction, kind of opening up that dialogue more, and more collaboration and more of this stuff. So we have a collaborative residency coming up. And so this is, you know, my dream has been more than answered by you guys, and I can't say how thankful and how much I love you guys. How amazing it's been. So that's a little background. And so what we're going to do tonight is really try and speak briefly, and I'll really try and speak briefly, because I'm so verbal. But we're each going to speak briefly. And what I really want, what I really envision, and what I really hope for is the kind of conversation that happened around that table that night. Of course, not the same kind of conversation, but a continuation or development of that conversation. There's one of the things that happened, I sent out an email to all of the artists in the show and said, you know, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking about? What would you like us to add to this discussion? And what ended up was an email exchange that ended up being as powerful as that conversation around the table. Really incredible stuff. Way more than we could ever even scratch the surface of tonight. But I envision this as the beginning or a continuation of conversations that have been happening for many, many years. And I'm hoping that this will be the first of many of these conversations that we can continue and open up. So I just want to say a couple of words. I'll probably edit what I've had here because I've already talked too long. And then our panelists will each say a few words, and we'll try and keep it brief so that we can really open it up for conversation. And I really hope that you will all join in this dialogue. Yeah, I think I probably won't say as much as I planned. But so I talked already about the Todd Aiken stuff, and I actually have, and I can pass these out. I only made a couple copies, but I've been compiling some of these Republican, and this is now like 8 pages or something like that. And this is just like the quickest scan of some of the, and actually I'll just pass it here, and I'm going to pass that to that end. Just food for thought. Some of the things that have been being said, because these are really, incredible things. So some of the things that came up for me and in the dialogue with the artist is first I want to say about Malala Yousafzai, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name right, and I want to keep her in mind because this is a conversation not just about us, American women of relative great privilege, but how do the conversations here, going on in the political arena here, affect women around the world? What happens with us, how we consider these privileges as rights and how we fight for those, how does that affect women around the world was kind of important to me. And I want to remember Malala in this conversation. Some of the things that people were talking about was the language, who owns this language about women's bodies, and how can we talk about that and affect change in that. Especially language that seems like magical thinking was a term that one of the artists used about women's bodies, and how that is, again, coded language to silence women. How can we as artists, and as women artists, and not just as women artists, but as people in general, but as artists in particular, and as women artists even more particularly, talk to each other in a way that challenges this conversation and opens it up. I think that's really important. Keeping that conversation deeply rooted in our particular experience, but while being really cognizant of the really widening range of experiences of women around the world, not just, the wide experiences that we have just as people in this room, but open that up to people from all over the world, different cultures, et cetera, et cetera. So to be always cognizant of that, respecting each other's experiences, and yet still being not afraid to kind of speak frankly was sort of really important. And the difference, yeah, I think one of the questions was questions of essentialism, the feminist questions of essentialism, and so for example, you have a show of women artists, do we keep this show going as just women artists in women-owned galleries, or do we want to open this conversation? What does that mean? What does that mean to kind of think about that? I think is an interesting conversation. The differences between generations of feminists was one of the things that came up, and conversations about how to speak across the generations and the different experiences that feminists have had. Like women of certain ages talking to younger women who are coming up and having different experiences, and women who came before us also with the same thing. So I think that's important. And I think that's a lot of stuff already. So I'm going to end, I just want to end with a quote from Faith Wilding, who's one of the artists of the show and seminal feminist artist that I thought was really great. She quotes, Luce Irigaray, among other feminist philosophers, calls us to encounter, cherish, and welcome difference, not just to tolerate it, and to open ourselves to experience and being with others. I'd like to see us to be able to build trust, cooperation, and mutual encouragement between generations, to end the war between waves, and to get down to the important work that feminism needs to do in the world. It will take all of us, with all our energies and differences, that is for sure. Get the women out of the binders, in solidarity and hope. Faith Wilding. So I thought that was a great note to start on. And with that, the panelists' bios are on your sheets, and I hope you'll read them. Of course, their bios go way beyond anything we can even cover this evening. But we're going to start with Jennifer.
Okay. Well, first, thank you for having me here. I'm really honored to be here tonight. I'm going to start with a poem, and it's titled Unstilled Volcano. Vesuvius, my home, glowing valley with luscious lips, never lying still, and tremors making magna flow. I'm coming, I'm here, with pressure building behind my corals, pulling open my plates, gliding along my soft edges, sliding into my cavern, parting my hot spots, shutting out the world, oozing away. with pleasure let through, myself no longer concealed, but found. So what inspired this unstill volcano? Two women inspired it, actually. One was Hélène Cixous, the French feminist intellectual, who states in her famous essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, quote, "I have been amazed more than once by a description a woman gave me of a world she had been secretly haunting, a world of searching, the elaboration of knowledge, on the basis of systematic experimentation with the bodily functions, a passionate and precise interrogation of her erotogeneity. This practice, extraordinarily rich and inventive, in particular as concerns masturbation, is prolonged or accompanied by a production of forms, a veritable aesthetic activity, each stage of rapture inscribing a resonant vision, a composition, something beautiful. I wish that woman would write and proclaim this unique empire so that other women, other unacknowledged sovereigns might exclaim, I too overflow. My desires have invented new desires. My body knows unheard of songs." And so I did just that, along with the aid of Emily Dickinson. Unstill Volcano is my postmodern response to two of Dickinson's poems which use volcanic imagery. One is number 601, A Still Volcano Life, and number 754, My Life Had Stood Below a Loaded Gun. Adrienne Rich and Christiane Miller have suggested that Dickinson uses images such as corals, lava, oozing, to suggest female genitalia and sexuality, in particular the labia and female ejaculation. So I heeded Cixous' advice, took Dickinson's ideas, and respun them into an unstill volcano, because I wanted to somehow erase my own sense of shame associated with down there, and just think of the semantics of that phrase and what that suggests, and also with autoerotic pleasures. So in 2012, women's bodies and pleasures are still being subjected to male gazes, dictates, and violations. And we see this in arts, in media, in politics, in virtually any institution dominated by heterosexual men, or that perpetuates heterosexist patriarchal values. And we also see this in violence and the increasing violence against women and girls. Statements like Aiken's, in spite of, negatively affects women's collective consciousness, in that it signals to us that despite our advances since the early 1970s, we face a risk of having the clocks kind of turned back, and going back to the days of the problem that has no name, if you remember Betty Friedan with the feminist mystique. It indicates that women's bodies continue to be spoken for, and not just by men, but also women who police the same values, and police each other in what Jacques Lacan calls the law of the father. And our bodies are also being endangered, because the implication is that we can't let our bodies speak for themselves. We can't trust our own bodies or how they operate. We can't trust ourselves. And women can't be trusted. That's another message that's being sent out there, unless women are ruled by the bastions of patriarchy. So this is discouraging to the female psyche, to say the least. So I don't know, is it time for another revolution akin to what we witnessed in the early 70s? We've seen a sort of rebirth and resurgence with the slut walks and with the efforts of Pussy Riot, but are such efforts enough? How do we make the world clitorate, as Sophia Wallace suggested on Facebook? And how do we stop seeing a hole, H-O-L-E, and instead start seeing a whole, W-H-O-L-E? Is it just by way of opening our mouths, so to speak, and letting our bodies speak for themselves in our daily interactions or in our artwork or our writings or legislations or whatever it is that we're doing? Or do we need to, as a collective, revive sisterhood? You know, that slogan in the early 70s with the radical feminist, sisterhood is powerful. Can sisterhood be powerful once more? So that's a question I'm going to throw out there.
So, Trisha Wright.
Hi everyone. I'll introduce myself to those of you who don't know me by just talking about this work and putting it into context. So the pieces in the show come out of my broader practice, which is primarily painting. The group of 5, the white pieces with the feathers and the hardware embedded into the pieces. My practice is primarily painting. They tend to be fairly large, labor-intensive, and very slow to produce, often anyway. So these pieces originally came out of an impulse to make work that was more immediate and more personal, and to introduce the body. Now, all of my work really addresses the home and the domestic realm in general, and my own personal experience as a mother, having raised 2 children and having spent 18 very intense years in the domestic realm. But these were, as I say, an attempt to address something that was much more personal and more immediate and to bring in the body. In fact, the first time I showed these, I felt very exposed and uncomfortable, and it said a lot to me about the difference between my other work, which is fairly reserved and held, kind of emotionally cool, and this, which felt like a journal and was really like exposing my body by putting them up on the wall. The work is really concerned with perception, how women are perceived in the sort of culture broadly and in mass media, and how they are presented and evaluated. And so I'm very interested in the relationship between decoration and function, and that dichotomy that really permeates the lives of ordinary women globally and here. So it's interesting what you were saying, because what my overall goal for relationships between men and women is to neutralize, is to bring together, to celebrate difference and to have equality. In the work, I bring together these often disparate objects, objects associated with the domestic realm that have no status or very little, trivial, throwaway objects that are associated with women's work, maybe combined with an object from the male world, which has undeniable automatic associations with work, so a grinding head embedded into a doily, for example. But I'm also really interested in the dichotomy between decoration and function. So you'll have a drain, which is an object of function, embedded into a doily, which is a decorative object. And because I'm really concerned with it's the dichotomy between the vagina and the pussy, whereas one is a functioning part of the body. It serves more than one purpose, but it is a functioning part. And the pussy is really a fantasy of that, sort of part of what a woman is. So bringing those two things together. Always, though, to bring together these opposites in an attempt to, well, by equalizing them, neutralize the differences so that they can be regarded as sort of approached on the same footing. I feel very strongly that the whole of the domestic realm is an area that's being neglected perennially by the art world, obviously by politicians. It's been co-opted by the right with all of the traditional values and all of that. And I think in terms of talking to younger women and other women in our community and beyond. I worry about focusing too much on the very young. Now, this is a very personal take on it, I guess, but I think my experience reflects that of many, many, many women, and certainly the vast majority of women globally. In that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the seeming complacency of younger women about feminist issues, and I was actually on the phone to my brother this week, and he was saying he was more discouraged by his students now than he has been in 25 years of teaching, that this is a different kind of generation. But I think that every generation experiences the world differently. And these young women, like my daughter's age, she's just 18, she's just gone to college, right through to the women in their 20s and to late 20s perhaps, they have benefited. Things have improved for them. And to say that that life is not better for them now is to really diminish what the feminists of the 70s really did achieve. They have grown up with these benefits, and they have a different understanding of what the challenges, you know, in life are. They, you know, the college years and after the college years, the life seems basically full of potential. They go through, you know, the degree, the postgraduate degree, then they maybe have their first job and start to put down roots. They may have a relationship, they may marry. Life still is relatively simple. You have, you know, you are a couple, you can share the chores, you have very little in terms of domestic drudgery, you have your own identities, you know, it's an equal footing. Then a child comes along, and perhaps another. And it's at that point when the mother, usually it's the mother, and certainly globally it's the mother, who stays at home with the child, 2 years at home, excuse me, I think then the realization hits at how unfairly the scales are weighted against the woman who is the mother, and that what has started off as a race, if you use that analogy, on an equal footing, becomes for her a three-legged race, and that gap between her and her partner widens with every passing year. So I think if we can revisit the role of ordinary women at home raising children, doing this hugely important job, which is another whole conversation I would like to talk more about, in terms of career, that sort of perception of what is important, how you value women, what women do, and what constitutes work, would shift the whole argument. And in terms of talking to younger women, or talking to an audience that's receptive, I think that the younger women, it's too soon. They haven't realized how life is weighted against them. I think if you talk to women in their 30s, women who've been at home for a couple of years, or even if they're working with someone else who's taking care of the children in the day, and that would be a woman, those women will be very, very receptive to the feminist issues that the younger women may be seeming to be complacent about. And then it's a matter of, well, what strategies do you use? And I'm not sure Pussy Riot and those sort of very performative activist groups will be speaking in a language that will relate to these women so much. They will, I think, connect more to stronger, older role models, women in positions of power. I was carried away.
And we have Rebecca Chalker, who is the author of The Clitoral Truth, which she has some copies here before.
Well, that's a little intro into my perspective, I guess. I also, if you read my little bio, teach the Cultural History of Sexuality, a course that I developed to both graduates and undergraduates. And by default, I became an historian. I can't help it. So I thought I'd give a little history today to attempt to sort of enlarge the discussion. This is certainly not to broaden the discussion and not to be critical of anyone or anything or any way of looking, but just to provide a few thoughts on this coming from my 30 years of work in this area. So how did vagina, if you will, become the default term for women's genitals in the larger narrative out there in the real world? Well, I have a little history about this. The first point I would make is that women's genitals, except in pornography and in fabulous art, not enough of it, are basically invisible, except in places, the upstart places that decide to do it. And so they basically are invisible and therefore illicit. So this is a little history of how I think vagina became the default term for women's genitals. From a woman's perspective, the vagina is most regularly an outlet for menstrual periods, menstrual blood. It's a space for fingers, fists, sex toys, what have you, both commercial and homegrown. It's a cozy space that provides a cozy space at just the exact amount of warmth and friction for male orgasm. Also provides an opportunity for intimate closeness between partners of any collection. And perhaps if doctors don't interfere, it's also a place, an occasional passage for a baby. But that's not how vaginas became the default definition for women's genitals. Edith LaRocque, probably everyone knows this, and produced a brilliant theater piece, Vagina Monologues. She first produced and acted by her in a tiny theater in Soho X number of years ago. In the late 90s, she got a few of her best friends together, Jane Fonda, Glenn Close, Whoopi Goldberg, this crowd, and did a one-shot deal on Broadway, Vagina Monologues on Broadway. Big, flashy time. Well, I was in Paris at the time, but instead of standing in the sold-out crowd in the street, being bitterly disappointed, I didn't get to see stars of the moment perform. But I read about it the next day in the New York Herald Tribune. Well, after I published the Clitoral Truth in 2000, I was already working on it at that time. I asked my agent why Eve's work had gotten so famous, and I was still standing on the sidelines. Star power, she said. So, in 2000, years that the Clitoral Truth came out, Vagina Monologues opened off-Broadway with each month would be one to three actresses to play the parts. Well, in July or August of that year, Donna Hanover Giuliani, who's a daytime talk show host and TV talk show host and TV actress, was scheduled to star in it off-Broadway. And the week before she started, she found out at a press conference that she was being divorced by Rudolph Giuliani, who had now been outed by some journalist as having a long-term affair with his office mate. So that brought massive vagina monologues everywhere. Well, so after I saw Vagina Monologues in Soho a couple of years before perhaps, I wrote Eve a 3-page letter saying, well, Eve, where's the clitoris? Well, she didn't answer. And Vagina Monologues went all over the world. Over 100 performances in countries you would not even believe if I could name them all, including Nigeria, where they wanted to X out lesbians, and Eve did say, sorry, can't do that. And at McMurdo Sound in Antarctica, where there was an uproar by the men of the group because they didn't want it around. They didn't want to see it. Vaginas, my God. Well, that's a little history, a little secret history that I know about some weird way. Anyway, so Eve didn't answer, but nonetheless, I found out later from Betty Dodson that after this big Broadway performance, Betty had gone backstage and was a little huffy. Eve, all right, where's masturbation in all of this? And apparently it was quite a heated exchange, so then Eve obliged Betty, she thought, by adding a piece that she had other pieces that she just edited out for various reasons, called the Vagina Workshop. Well, Betty was really pissed off then because it was not a vagina workshop. It was Betty's body sex workshops that she had run for 22 or so years to help women become more comfortable and acquainted with and first on first name basis with, if you will, with their genitals and learning about orgasm and, you know, fun and sex. So that was Betty and Eve, and that didn't work out so well, I guess. So, but this all put vagina sort of on the map in a big way that you can't buy this, it just happens. Okay, now we come around later on, the last, I'd say 5 or 6, I don't know, years, is it? The vulva. So vulva has now become, I think, among a lot of women who identify as feminist or who are a little more verbalized or something, a little more able to interact with it, has become another sort of default name for women's genitals. Well, vulva means covering, and what you can see anyway of women's genitals, and depending on what demographic you belong to, how much you can see. Yeah. So, but it's not what you can see, it's what it does for you that's important. But this has become the new default, it's one of the new default terms. And as most of you probably know, that until about 8 weeks of gestation, the fetus appears to be female. The template is female. And then at about 8 weeks, testosterone kicks in in XY fetuses and rearranges what is clitoral tissue into a penis. But women, the clitoris doesn't lose any of those parts. They remain. The clitoris maintains as a stable entity. The penis is the new boy on the block, if you will. So, and I think that's really interesting that the template is female. So really, it was Adam out of Eve instead of the other way around. But you can't blame the Hebrews for that. They did not know at the time. They didn't have all this science to tell them all these things. Okay. So, but I think an important feature point here is that if the clitoral template does not have the potential for a feature, the penis can't have it. The big one is the prostate. And most of these things are still somehow all there in little or bigger form. So wherefore the clitoris? Well, in 1978, my colleagues, I was hired by the Feminist Women's Health Center in California to edit a book called The New View of the Woman's Body. And this group actually redefined the clitoris. It did a lot of anatomical research, including historical illustrations going back to the 19th century, and redefined the clitoris as having 18 operative parts that either participate in, contribute to, or are changed by orgasm. And this is the most definitive definition that pretty much exists today, although I monitor anatomical books all over the planet, and they're moving along, they're coming along, they really are, to include more than 2 or 3 parts. And that's a really good thing. So I will just finish with a note a quote from the historian Thomas LaCour, whose book, Making Sex, the Body and Gender from the Greeks to Freud, showed me definitively that the Feminist Women's Health Center's definition of the clitoris was accurate. LaCour went all the way back to the ancient Greeks he documented all the way back. And he said that bodies in these accounts, he's talking about these anatomical accounts from the Greeks forward to Freud, where he stopped. Bodies are not the sign of the foundation of civic society. And what he means by that is that until we see women's genitals as equivalent to men's, really the penis is equivalent to the clitoris, but you can't talk about it that way because nobody will understand you. But until we see women's genitals as equivalent and as powerful and as responsive and meaningful as men's, women will never be equal.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Well, that brings up the point. One of the points of contention was the language that people use to define the women's body parts and what those are. Hi. Because there were some people who felt uncomfortable with the fact And this whole discussion erupted about the clitoris versus the vagina and all of that. So I think that's an interesting point. See what people think about that. We use the term vagina very specifically because of the political language. It came right out of the political discussion. So that was the source of it for this particular exhibition. But I think it is a really interesting question. So I think that, come on, that's okay, come on in. We're casual here, come on. We're just starting the conversation about clitoris and vagina, so you're right time. So I think that a lot of interesting ideas have been raised, the ideas of the domestic and the public, when the domestic becomes political, or when the private becomes political. Come on in. Second wave. It's great to be around. It's a different kind of wave.
It's perfect to say when the private becomes political, it's sort of like when the private becomes political. But it is this interesting, this dialogue that you don't, there's hardly, in the anatomy book, there's nothing to this up. So I remember as a child, at the age of 12 and 13, trying to understand my own sexuality, and my parents weren't going to have that dialogue with me, but we had a sex education book from when one of my parents was in college that my sister and I would go to and look at the pictures and try to understand what's normal for us to be thinking about, what's not so normal. And I just remember being drawn to these pictures and trying to understand, even down to tampon advertisements and the instruction sheets. I remember when you started your period, chances are your mom wasn't there by your side to say, here's how you insert a tampon. We look at these really abstract images, trying to figure out, well, what part is that? Because until that moment, you maybe never even tried to explore your own parts, much less publicly. I remember that whole painful period of getting to understand my own sexuality with men, and half the time they couldn't find my parts. So, there's a real truth to that larger sort of mystery in the public eye of what are we composed of.
Then there's symbolic words, and then there's accurate words.
Right.
And there's the danger of, there's a fine line between accuracy and semantics.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about how people say grow a pair, or have some balls or whatever, or it's a ballsy thing to do, well, think about that could not be a more vulnerable, delicate, easily damaged sort of thing, the testicle. You think, the way people talk about it, that they were made out of adamantine, like cast iron balls, but they're so fragile. But it's used, symbolically to be all things testosterone, I guess. But the word may not literally be the accurate use of the word, but it's a symbolic use of the word, and we know what it means. It's different to the word pussy, which would be interesting to hear what you have to say about pussy.
Okay, well, let me just respond first, because I had a hard time about that age trying to figure out what labia were. This is the problem with the medical language, is that it's all in medical terms, and one thing that the group that I worked with did was they tried to use the functional names whenever possible, because they're definitely more expressive than labia and things that are Latin, basically Latin words. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about terminology, and I'm very curious about the panelists' views on the reclamation of the word cunt from a misogynistic slur to something that we own.
That relates to what you're talking about.
It's hard. It depends who's talking, I think. We can appropriate all we like, but unless you're in a group that's sympathetic to the way that you think, it still has a sort of law unto its own. It will be used however popular culture wants to use it. Things can be appropriated slowly, but I think that's a hard word.
We did a faculty production of Vagina Model. It must have been about 8 or 9 years ago at Case where I teach, and the dean had the part. The dean of Arts and Sciences School had the part where it's written in, you know, she says cunt, and then she screams it out like 4 or 5 times, and the auditorium went wild. I mean, they loved it. And it resonated with them, for sure, even if they don't use it themselves, to hear it.
And even the word vagina causes such a stir. So it's not a slur. So there's a great long way away from, you know, you can use the word vagina in Parliament would be an achievement.
The Florida legislature, I'm from Tallahassee, Florida, in case people I'm definitely Southern. Last year, one of the Republican legislators put in a little bill or regulation or something. You can't say uterus on the Senate floor because it's offensive. And a Democratic, I believe she was Democratic, senator had said something in terms of anatomical reference, and she was booed.
That's interesting because if you look at the document I passed around of things that I've collected, there's when the Michigan representative was silenced, I think it was Daily Cost, it's in there, but went back and found all of the times that men had used the word and, you know, were not silenced. So it seems like it's only offensive when it's spoken by a woman, which I thought was really interesting. They were usually talking about it in terms of laws about reproductive health and stuff like that. It just occurred in conversation, but they were never silenced. So there's like 5 or 6 notes of times that men stated it without that. I think one of the interesting things about the language too is well, not just about the language, but about talking about sort of being open about our bodies and sexuality. And for me personally, in a world where we live in a reality-based, you know, reality TV kind of world. So for me, I tend to have spent most of my life trying not to be humiliated in public, rather than, you know, opting for it as a career choice. And so the idea of when does speaking your story, you know, proudly and frankly become this kind of gratuitous Oprah, you know, reality TV kind of moment. I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's a line that we walk, because like saying cunt or saying, you know, these words are difficult, and telling your personal story can be really difficult. So I don't know if there's not an answer, but
I just wanted to say that, you know, when I was described what sex was by my mother, I was very young, and she used very specific medical terminology. You know, she took out a pencil and she put a dot on a piece of paper and she said that's the size of a female egg, and ejaculation, and penis and vagina, and where it had disturbed my older sister, where she was like, I don't want daddy doing that to you. It just kind of rolled off my shoulders. And when it comes to terminology about female genitalia, I find the word cunt a lot more powerful than pussy. And it's my typical word of preference. For me, it equates to dick, like where there's that back end behind it, and it's not just shock value, but there's something really substantial behind it that can be just as, I mean, there was discussion about violence and sex, and I feel like that's where the equality for the terminology of those two slurs, you know, meet. So I think the way that you use the terminology is, the way you present it is just how you present it is how it's taken, rather than necessarily the word that you use.
well, it's been interesting to see how people reacted to, you know, the show. I'm sending out emails to a couple of thousand people on my gallery list, and I'm, you know, kind of wondering how people are going to react to this new legitimate vagina and pussy talk. And it seemed like the pussy talk was the one that upset people a little bit more. Even some feminists who were here, they were like, you know, the legitimate vagina, that's really cool, but you know, the pussy talk, that's a little uncomfortable. And I'm not sure why. I mean, it kind of feels like a more violent term, if you will. Or maybe it's just my age.
Yeah,
or sort of, maybe harsh.
I think it's a harder term, but I think, you know, people say, you know, oh, stop being a pussy, this, that, and the other, but usually kind of equates to like bitch. and bitch has a power behind it, I think.
Well, what's it, Sasha?
I think, I think the original charge of feminism is a large, newer vision of the world that's going to empower everyone. And so I wonder, I think that everybody brought up really interesting things that started a long time ago and kind of dropped away, and now we've progressed so much that those conversations have died. But like Patricia was saying, how like there needs to be a celebration of difference, and so I worry about equating the clit with the penis, because I think that the nature of female sexuality and male sexuality is different, and so the French feminists, that Sisu and Irigaray, talked a lot about how to envision a new kind of worldview based upon women's sexuality, and something that you said about that we still live in a phallocentric world, and so we need to revisit those conversations about how to talk about women's sexuality and women's body parts and how women can think about their bodies in a way that can empower us and empower everyone. So I don't. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's medical and biology is really important, but I think it's also so much in our heads, and we have to really revisit those kinds of more philosophical conversations.
Well, it goes back to the idea, the questions of essentialism, which I always had issues with. So to me, it's not so much about sexuality, it's about humanity, right? I mean, not to get too way out, but it's because I think that it's a question for men, and also the gender is a continuum, right? There's people on all places on that continuum, and there's not only that, but there's just the more global conversation, the conversations between different cultures and different races and different sexes and different expressions of sexuality. That's the conversation. I think that's where I felt, the conversation, at least in terms of people that I related to, had gone. But it's interesting that the culture seems to have regressed back to like 1955, and you feel like you need to be wearing an apron and stuff like that. So, I don't know. I just think that idea of essentialism is what the danger of where it comes in when you start to want to speak too specifically about women's sexuality. Is that making sense? Instead of sexuality as like in general. Like I would be interested to hear what men have to say about this conversation.
But I do think one something I want to chime in, because you hit on this. I think that as I was growing up and this idea of feminism, it always seemed like what we were really aspiring towards was humanism, and that was where we were trying to be. That's what we wanted to ultimately get to, is this idea that we would celebrate our differences, but we would recognize that our common thread was that we're all in this together, we're all human. And I do feel like I share that same sentiment with you, that I feel like we have, there are people that I meet on a daily basis that are well entrenched in that ideology and are heading toward it, but more and more I feel like in the media, we are in the dark ages, and we have lost so much ground and so much that we've gained. And I don't think it's just women when I say we. I mean people, humans, all of us together. So that's sort of where I'm at.
I do think that, I teach college, so I all those complicated questions about young people. But I think that, and we have young people, seem to me to be much more comfortable with a more fluid definition of just about everything. So maybe our definition of what was political maybe is not quite the same as what someone else, like you said, that it's growing up in a different environment. So that fluidity about sexuality or gender or race, or I think is, it's an interesting development. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I come from a very different planet. I'm Eastern European, Romanian more specifically. And I think when I came to this country, and that was not that long ago, 1999, the word feminism was very strange to me, and it was very dirty. Like, it was like women wanted to wear pants and they go with men, and it was a very kind of cliche, very, of course, from a perspective that was mostly uneducated. And also, how I grew up, you know, like under the communism, and I'm saying that in quotes because what we lived there was not, when I hear, I just want to comment on when I hear Obama is a socialist, and I'm like, I can tell you what that means. Don't go there. And also, we didn't even leave the socialism or communism. That's actually the word. It was an aberration. But the society, especially in Romania, was so corrupt. And they had they were paying lip service. Not that this one is not corrupted. Let me put this. It was so twisted, right? And the women were put equal with men. So I grew up in a language that women and men are equal, you can do everything. But as you were saying, once you hit like 20s and you have to go to college and then actually you have to get married and have kids, things are completely shifting and you're totally lost. And that equality was not there. And on top of it, the leaders of our society were very much heavyweight, like physically, and they were very dumb because they were promoted on political issues, not on like capacity. So that feminism was very tinted for me, you know, with this deformation, if you want. Like it was a very strange, evil twist that, oh, women who are equal with men are kind of stupid, and not very honest. And it was very strange. So I came here, I was like, oh, I didn't know why I came, but my journey was to discover myself as an artist because I was repressed, but I couldn't even say it. Because in film school, I couldn't get, I wanted to be a cinematographer, and you see me shooting here, but I was told that bluntly, you cannot be in this department because we just don't take women, and that was 12, 13 years ago. And I couldn't even process like why I'm in pain, why I want out of there. When I came here, I realized, oh, my art has to be related to me as a woman. And then, you know, the whole discovery of feminism kind of came in slowly, and I started reading, and I realized, oh, this is a beautiful thing. But I'm sorry, it's a long journey. I'm coming to the fact that we're caught in words. And if you read George Lakoff, I don't know why I'm going to that, don't think of an elephant. This is framed. We're framed and we need either a new word or a redefinition. And this is important for me. Like right now I'm listening to all this and oh my God, this is a feature documentary that we're like all sitting on and it's so important. But it's really like redefining, because I see young people being very conservative. And I do understand their reason. You know, sometimes, because I teach as well. And I'm listening to all sides, because for me, in a way, I'm an outsider, so I can play that. And they have some reason, but then they're, you know, they're narrow. They're like caught into.
So it brings up for me the idea of coded language,
yeah,
and how our language gets co-opted.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
it gets co-opted by, you know, whatever's convenient, right? It can be co-opted by the right, you know, it can be co-opted by capitalism or whatever, and fed back to us, you know, as a commodity in a way. And I think the right has managed to make feminism a really dirty word. So even if a young woman is, you know, having all of the same feelings, like I want to express myself and develop my work.
It's the idea that I think in this generation and this time has gone from one extreme of taboo and not talking about it to talking about it so blatantly without any real understanding. Or you mentioned, I thought the most prominent word for me was respect, where the art, it kind of brings back the point that it is about art also. It is about beauty. It is about respect and appreciation of the body and the function and the whole connection to nature and to men and just the value system that we lose trace of. We really kind of lose that essence when you go from one extreme to the next, from hot to cold. So for me, I think it's about finding that medium, and I think topics and opportunities where you display the art, where you have that questioning and the voice, where you can actually examine it from a woman's perspective, from a man's perspective, bringing in economics and family, because it's really all relative. You know, it's really all relative, and what scares me, again, with the generation now is that it's just really about the body and in this like very objectified way, as opposed to the beauty and the essence that really came through art. You know, when you look at sculptures and paintings and things where the body was honored, whether it was nude portraits, you know, whether it was drawings or sketchings or sculptures, and it was more from it was beautified as opposed to now where it's more objectified. And so things like this help, and shows like this and conversations like this, and I know speaking for myself too as a woman, and I have a daughter and nieces, and it's a matter of having that conversation and having that forum to talk, whether it's at home or through exhibits, and you as a parent, as a woman, as an aunt, you know, having those conversations as opposed to them learning on their own or through friends, and not really getting that beauty, that art, that appreciation, and that value. I think that's what's missing, that medium. So for me, that target is finding that medium and a way to bring both of them together, where you do have the physical and anatomical part, but then you have the beauty and how it connects on a larger scale. And that's what we're missing, in my opinion.
No, I think it's really important point, and it goes back to kind of what I was saying about the reality world that we live in, where we're seeing everything, but we're actually seeing nothing.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's like everything is revealed, but nothing is sort of there.
Right.
And I would love to hear what young people think about this, because I'm not young. So
I have a light anecdote, and it's actually, Martin actually just made me aware of it, because I didn't see the connection made. I was thinking about our own, I think, hesitation about making our work about, you know, the vagina.
yeah.
But recently, I had some students do a series of sketches and have them go and find resources, visual references that match their sort of instinctive sketching. And one of the students decided he was going to go to the library and he's going to seek out elephant skulls and hip structures. So he's looking for nudes. So both students went into one of the computer labs on the campus of the university and put in nudes. The difference was one student put art nudes in their search. One of them came back empty-handed and said, I couldn't get anything. The system shut down. We can't access those images. Another student came back with 10 images of these, you know, very graceful photographic nudes as reference material. And, you know, this is the sort of stunning thing. We're seeing absolutely everything or absolutely nothing. And if we aren't, and this is, you know, this access, this idea that somehow we're so afraid that our children are going to see something that we want to protect them from has completely filtered this experience of understanding the full world in many ways. So this is a whole other topic of, you know, censorship and what are our children able to get their hands on any other time they're not in an academic institution where they should be able to have access to these things anyway.
That nothing is, for me, the nothing is relationship. Like the thing that we're not seeing, right? We're seeing everything in reality TV, but what we don't get is relationship. So that, going back just to the original night where we're sitting around this table talking, what was so incredibly powerful was not that we were telling stories of personal things, because you see that on TV every day of the week, right? But it was about the relationship and the thing that happened when people sat down and shared their stories in a kind of a very safe and environment. So when you're talking about sexuality, a lot of people are getting their education about sexuality through pornography, like you said, but through porn, and that's nothing to do with actual reality, right? It's not real people in relationship. The relationship is not there. So I think for me, it's relationship, and that's why this, for me, is such a powerful thing. It's about the relationship.
Yeah,
There's a sort of a discussion now going on about how pornography is the new sex educator.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
It used to be 15-year-old boys. And they've been the availability of pornography.
Well, it distorts everyone's. But there's that whole conversation, my son's 13, obviously he has access to a computer, I'm not naive, but how, or even I teach high school, and how kids know so much, but they know nothing. You know, like, and I'm not dissing kids at all, but it's true, like they have access to so much more, but they haven't experienced any of it, or, you know, and at the same time, they're really like freaked out by it, you know. So it's like, I don't want you guys to talk, because I'm not trying to be official speaker of the kids or anything. But they know they're you know, they are so exposed to the world that they, you know, maybe haven't left their city ever, you know. So it's like a big difference.
Do you guys have anything? Not to put you on the spot. You don't have to
I
say
that.
You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but you know, it's really important to have young people's voices in this conversation. It's really powerful.
As far as I'm concerned with pornography, I've noticed guys expect that when it comes to sexual relations, it's like that's not how you go to a person, that's not how you treat a person. They get paid to do this, and that's why it comes out this way. It's not a relationship, like we were saying before. So I do think when people are exposed, when kids are exposed, or people younger than me, are exposed to porn, it just taints them. It's not, they shouldn't be able to see things like that. Then again, you can't control what a person does, because the internet has so much access. Like, you can access a lot. And it gets complicated also because, like, you can read about all these different things, you can search for all these different things, like, you can just keep feeding your mind these different images and these different thoughts, and they're all from a different perspective, and until you experience it yourself, you're not really going to know. And that also taints younger kids, because they go in the world thinking that they know, and get ultimately disappointed when they find out it's completely different than what they thought. So that's my perspective on that.
How does that affect your life?
It's affected my life because there have been guys that think they know what a woman wants from watching porn, or from reading other people's experiences, or from watching movies and thinking that's what it is, and it's like, that's false. These are things you watch for entertainment, it's not reality. So when I approach men, or when I'm in some type of relationship with a guy and they have these ideas and I tell them something otherwise, they think they know automatically what to do. So it's frustrating. And I just think there should be less access to these things, or we should be more social in reality. So we can learn how to interact with people other than something that's not really there, something invisible, because the internet's not physical.
Right. There's nothing like being in a room with people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing like it. You guys think?
Well, it's interesting because we talk about the internet, but it's almost to the point where you can't get away from, I guess, the distortion. I mean, if you put on the radio and you're the average child and you haven't had that talk, and you're 10 or 11, and just some of the terms used towards females, or the terms used actually, you know, the majority of the artists you're going to hear, they're going to be males, and they're going to be given some ridiculous talk sexually. So then so you're 10 and then you're 11, so then your expectations are just so off the charts that how you move into the world and courtship, or how we want to call it, it's just so distorted. It's difficult because I teach high school, and I see the way that the boys, they talk, and I just, when I try to say, look, you guys can't talk like that, one is wrong, two, there's ladies in the room. I mean, I can give a list of reasons, and at the same time, it's just like, you could tell nobody has checked them before. And they're looking at me like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, what's wrong with me? I'm trying to help you out. Like, you sound like, you know, you sound ridiculous right now. And to them it's the norm.
Yeah.
So when you try to, basically help them to navigate through this realistically, not this hyped up version, it's difficult for them. So in some ways I'm angry at them, and in other ways I feel for them. I'm sympathetic. Like, well, if I was them and the radio and like you guys say with the internet access, how else are they supposed to think?
Right.
Like,
How do you transform that conversation, or how do you find ways to?
You can try to find literature, you try to find alternatives, you find articles, just whatever ways you can slip in some type of alternative. And beyond that, you model. You do what you can to model, and it's difficult because there's not a lot of, when you turn on the television, I just wish there was an alternative. If there was this, one particular guy, and it goes back, even a long time. I saw something on James Bond this week. It's 50 years of James Bond. I mean, he's quite the chauvinist. And, he's suave and whatnot. So then you're like, well, where's a real vulnerable man that is kind of in touch with things? It'd be hard to come up with 2 or 3. Like right now, I'm sitting here thinking, I can think of James Bond like that.
Right.
And I can think of much worse than James Bond. But it was. Well, worse. But it's really hard to come up with a man that actually would, have the type of emotional intelligence.
That's who I just thought of. The Cosby family.
Maybe.
Bill Cosby, they were just even at the time having a black family with 2 intact parents. They were both working. I mean, that was radical at the time. But those families, I think, they were, to me, at least a little more realistic than, say, the Brady Bunch. But I mean, they would, that was like fake. But they would like have conversations with their children, and that was like radical TV, especially at the time. And I'm gonna just go back. It's not always the boys. Just not to be male bashing, it's the girls too. I teach high school. And there's some girls that, from what they see on TV, they have to be sexual, and they have to be this, and they have to be that. And some of the boys are all like, whoa, so it goes both ways. I think, especially if it's middle school, high school.
To the point that they incentivize it almost.
Yeah.
To the point where the boy who's talking just ridiculously vulgar, they laugh and they'll continue the conversation.
Right.
And then that would give him more reason to continue.
But I'm saying there's even girls that are the aggressors, because of that. So
it's a culture. It goes back to the images, and what he was saying is it's crucial. You can get away from it because I teach. I alternate between higher education and inner city kids. This is what I've done for a long time, about 10 years. And the last batch I had from New Haven, and it was pretty shocking in terms. Like, how can you teach them what's beautiful? Like, how can you share something like this to be appreciated? Because I have even, in the university, Trinity College where I teach right now, people who are laughing at things that are a little bit more subtle. They're saying, oh, that's so bad. And I'm like, you just don't say that. But going, for them, it's extremely powerful. It's like a wave, a tide, like a rip current that they're going to take you, And the question is, how do you share something like this in classroom? Because if we don't reach that gap, we lost. We can talk until 3 days where we can drop dead, but we're not going to do anything.
I think it goes back to the home.
Yeah,
You're not having those conversations
at
home. You can be 10, you can be 13, you can be 23, you can be 43. If you've never had those conversations about sex, about sexuality, about your body, you're going to be embarrassed.
Of course.
And an adult can be embarrassed. And so an adult can come into here and say, oh, laugh, and not be able to see the beauty and appreciation if they've never been taught that they themselves are beautiful in that way, or it's something that has subtleties, extremes. Again, seeing the whole scope. So if you just see it and like, you know, you were saying it's about TV or internet or radio and it's just, you know, again, something that you're just seeing the superficial part, you're not seeing all of the layers behind it and the value behind it, an adult is gonna laugh. You know, my daughter will probably come in here, she's 6, and be more intrigued and be able to see the beauty in it and say, Mommy, that looks like a flower, or Mommy, that looks like a this, and be able to see a connection in nature, whereas an adult will come in here and laugh, oh God, that's crazy, pussy, cunt. You know, it'd be probably more than that. And you know, so that gap is because there's a huge gap again in communication. And so it's, again, in my opinion, again, it goes back to the taboo thing and being able to have that conversation so you as a woman, as a man, can feel comfortable to entertain the idea of something that's seen as risque, but you see it as something different and you see the value in it. And we don't do that as a society. We don't do it as a family. No, because it's like anything else, it's a trickle-down effect. If your mother didn't do it or father didn't talk, then you learned about it through your peers. Then you have kids and you learn about it through your peers. So it's just a matter of breaking the cycle and starting to have conversations in your nucleus so that when you go into a place you can seem like, yes, I'm civil and educated and cultured, and you can look at it and say, wow, that reminds me of O'Keeffe. But if you haven't had that, then you're going to laugh and say, oh gosh, because you feel embarrassed because you haven't entertained the idea of your own sexuality and been spoken with value. It still comes back to the home. So, you know, in my opinion. You know, I get passionate now about it. You know,
it's great. I love
that's
that.
what it is. It comes back to that.
I think that you're absolutely right, but for me, the family is you know, it's like a rippling.
Yeah,
right. It's the family that it's your immediate blood family. It's the family, the extended blood family, and then it's all of the rest of your family, like this.
Right. Exactly.
And that we don't all grow up in families that have that, and how can we counterbalance it? And that's one of the things that the reasons, just to bring it all kind of back, was why, one of the main reasons why I thought that this was something powerful, because I considered myself, you know, somewhat educated and, you know, enlightened, blah, blah, blah. But when we sat around that table talking, I realized that that was a powerful conversation that I hadn't been having. Do you know what I mean? I realized how much of that conversation I hadn't been having and how much it meant to me and how it was about relationship, and that the simple act of sitting across a table with people, you know, breaking bread, so to speak, is transformational. And so if you may not have the family, but you can create the family, and we can transform, and maybe I'm completely idealistic, and I am, but we can transform our lives, and we have big political transformations that need to happen, right, obviously, but we also can transform our lives in situations like this. Like, I'm changed by the fact that you're all here sitting in my space, you know, with some idea that I had a month and a half ago, and it happened. It's amazing. Like, it's a really powerful, amazing thing, and I'm so thrilled and happy and honored, and I hope, and again, I hope that this is a conversation. I do believe in conversation. I do believe that relationships transform, and we have to do that both on the macro level, but also on the political, on the micro level, and also on the macro political level. But I don't think we can do it if we don't do this first. You know, so thank you all.
I just want to reconstruct this whole idea of conversation. I think you just don't feel that it isn't powerful. There was this woman, Sherry Turkle, has done these studies about what's happening to our culture because of text messaging, and that people are afraid of conversation. So if you have a text, you're controlling that. Like, you're not in this existential moment where who knows what the other person's going to say. And so people are retreating into this more and more because it's there. But it only shows you how powerful conversation is that people are afraid of it. And I, you know, again, being a little bit idealistic like Patricia, I think it's really worth a try, even if there's this blaring, bludgeoning stuff coming from the radio or from porn sites on the internet. That's a very false kind of power. And you can, there's a kind of wonderful way that you can operate underneath that radar by just being willing to have honest conversations, and with students, with, you know, your family, whatever kind of nucleus you're around. You know, if you're willing to do it, it's scary, and that's why it's powerful. And the word conversation has come up in this afternoon about 1,000 times in different contexts, and that's, I think, maybe the crucial thing here is, and the art is another form of conversation, because all of what you were saying about how this incredibly loud, noisy, American too, this kind of false notion of, you know, human sexuality and all that is so loud, that's a form of not saying anything. That's a, you know, Freudian truism that if you scream about something, you're not really saying it. You're afraid to just come out and say it. And so I think art and conversation have sort of an analogous role to play in getting, what you were saying, this nuance and life and organic wholeness. And don't think it isn't powerful. It's the very fact that it's powerful that makes everyone shy away from it.
The word conspire, just to maybe end this very shortly, but actually means to breathe together. So we have such a negative connotation of conspiratorial. But I mean, in a sense, we conspire when we come together, because what I would hope is that, you know, this is not like, oh, that was an interesting evening, and let's all go back to, you know, the porn and the TV, Kardashians waxing their, you know, their hoo-has. So and watch their vaginas. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that that's the example of everything's revealed and nothing is revealed. But this conversation can lead to other conversations, not just with us here, which I would hope to, I would invite you to keep, you know, to get on the mailing list of the gallery. We can continue this conversation, but also you can take that conversation, you know, we can take this conversation. Because that's what happened from that initial conversation. It spurred a lot of different conversations that were really powerful.
I think it's great. I mean, the mere fact that we're all showing up tonight, I think, because we unconsciously are picking up on the falsehoods and the distortions that are out here. So that's why we're here tonight, you know, to have that, to have a real conversation.
Maybe Conspire could be the name of the show that combines men and women.
Yeah, that's good. Yes, we're convinced that this show will continue, and I, you know, we were talking about, you know, women's galleries and stuff like that, and I really felt like I wanted that. I think it's important for women to have a space to have a voice and to show their work, and that women, you know, that's really important. But it's not the whole conversation. That's, you know, that it really is a bigger conversation. I think men are just as, I mean, from all the amazing men that I know in my life, I certainly have had just extraordinary men in my life, that it's not a conversation just for women. I mean, we're all oppressed by this kind of, you know, this kind of emptiness and this kind of lack of relationship. So you know, if I could kind of send you out with, this is the teacher in me, I can send you out with a, you know, an assignment, right? Is to think about conversation and in your life as you think about this conversation, but take that conversation with you and in all the conversations you have, and have new conversations, and invite people into conversations and say, no, I don't want to text. Let's have actual conversations on. And you know, that would be, if we do only that, I think it's really powerful. I mean, I hope we'll do more, but you know, that's a big first step. So I thank you so much for being here, and I really hope that you'll come back.